Welcome to Mastering Life's Adventures, an educational podcast about tapping into your true self, the soul, the substance of your life, to discover what life's ups and downs are really about, and how to have a greater sense of purpose, peace, joy, and fulfillment. I am Dr. Judith Holder, your host, coach, psychologist, fellow seeker who enjoys diving into the connections between spirituality, psychology, wellness, and your everyday life's adventures. All preparing and polishing you like the facets of a magnificent diamond to be your best self. If you're craving more from your life, you are in the right place. Come, let's journey together and transforming what you know into who you really are. Mastering Life's Adventures begins now.
Have you ever had a day that seemed to go wrong before anything had really happened? Nothing disastrous took place. No major crisis unfolded. And yet, inside, something had already shifted. Your peace was gone. Your energy felt low, flat. Your emotions were unsettled. And if you paused long enough to really look, you might discover that what changed the day was not the outer event itself of any type, but it was the thought you started believing about it. A look from someone, a delayed text, a comment that felt a little off, a mistake at work, a memory from years ago, a fear about what may happen next. One thought becomes another, and then another, and then another. And before long, the mind has created a whole emotional atmosphere. Most people never realize how much of life is being filtered through that quiet, constant internal conversation. Hi, I'm back with another key to soul progress, and that is noticing your thoughts. Because as we've talked about the Emotional Alchemy series, and we've talked about the Rewritten series, now I thought it's going to be important to really talk about some of these foundational stones that I periodically have talked about before, but as we're moving forward, we have to be keenly aware if we're on a spiritual path and we want to make change in our life, our thoughts. Notice your thoughts. In this episode, we're going to explore two important things. First, how the thought you repeat internally shapes your emotions, reactions, relationships, confidence, and spiritual development. And then second, how learning to observe your thoughts rather than instantly merging with them begins to restore your inner clarity, your freedom, your connection to the deeper truth within you, your soul, the substance of your life that is tied into the mediator, which is Christ, Jesus Christ. And so what my hope is that by the end of this episode, I would like you to walk away with two things. One, I want you to have a clear understanding of how your inner dialogue quietly influences your everyday life, and often more than the external circumstances. And the other is, I want you to lead with a practical way to start noticing your thoughts so you can interrupt patterns that keeps you anxious, discouraged, defensive, resentful, or even stuck, or even this kind of low-grade irritability, this low grade of anger and frustration that's taken place in your mind, in your world, that's impacting your being. This is one of the most foundational lessons in all real growth. And that is, notice your thoughts. Because if you cannot hear the voice of your own conditioned mind, you will mistake it for reality. And when that happens, you do not just think a thought, you live it. And you now live something that may not be true, that you've conjured up in your mind, that has created a lot of feeling of animosity or resentment or anxiety. So this is why I think understanding or having a greater awareness of your thoughts becomes so critical, because we have talked about the spiritual path, and people sometimes imagine something dramatic or mystical, and they think of major awakenings and profound revelations or extraordinary experiences. But very often, soul growth begins in a much quieter space. It begins with noticing what is happening inside the mind, your mind. This may sound simple, but it is not small. The reason this matters so much is that most human beings do not merely have thoughts. They are being run by thoughts. They have not examined, looked at, turned over the rock, see what's underneath that thought. They have not. They just have assumed it to be themselves. They assume that whatever appears in the mind must be true, important, and personal, and worthy of immediate reaction, worthy of immediate attention. They do not realize that the mind is often replaying old conditioning, old fear, old angst, old interpretations and expectations, and learned habits of perception. Let me just underscore this, because it's important for you to hear this, that there is this replay that goes on in our minds that we're taking as our reality, but they're really old conditioning, whether it's about things we feared in the past and are coming up again in a new situation, but the fear theme is still there. Old interpretations about how we interpreted before, and now we're interpreted the same way. And I just had this happen with a family member who interpreted things in an old way in terms of behavior of how she needs to be. But her new reality changes that. But she's still operating from the old script, the old way of doing things. We have to be aware of this. And the origins of it is in our thoughts. So that also happens with when we have old wounds or expectations of the past. And after a while, because if things being done consistently on a regular basis, they become learned habits of perception, learned habits of being that are not necessarily operating from a point of where you would want to be as you're walking your spiritual path at this stage in your life. One of the deepest spiritual principles in this is you cannot transform what you do not observe. Awareness always comes before mastery. And if you do not notice the thought, you cannot question it. And if you do not question it, you will probably believe it. And if you believe it, you will feel from it, act from it, build your life from it. This is why thought awareness begins all growth. And I'm going to talk about some other things that also are just as important, going a little bit deeper in terms of emotions. But right now, let's just focus on thought awareness. Because from a psychological perspective, thoughts influence emotions, and emotions influence behavior. But from a spiritual perspective, there is something even deeper. Thoughts influence the level of consciousness from which we live. Repeated fear-based thoughts narrow perception. Repeated resentful thoughts harden the heart. Repeated self-condemning types of thoughts drain vitality. And repeated judgments and being judgmental type of thoughts separate us from others. Where there is judgment, there's usually also criticism and some level of condemnation. And I've talked about this as a CCJ in the past. And so these themes that keep on coming up, we have to keep on putting into the forefront of our awareness. I'm trying to keep things continually in the forefront of your awareness as you're trying to walk our spiritual path. So repeated hopeless thoughts cloud the soul's capacity to remember truth. Learning to notice your thoughts is not simply a mental health tool, though it certainly helps mentally and emotionally in terms of your well-being. It is also a spiritual principle, a spiritual discipline. It helps you to separate the noise of the conditioned mind from the wiser, steadier awareness that exists beneath it, that exists in the depths of who you are, that exists in your soul, and the auspices of that soul tied into the Christ energy that is within you, that is helping to direct and guide you if you tap into it. This is why a deeper awareness matters, because many people are trying to improve their life while still being completely entangled with the very thought patterns that keep producing the life that they say they do not want. Have we all noticed that? It's like, I know I want this over here, but I haven't been truly aware or observant that this type of thought is not going to get me there. And it's a continuous working on oneself. I'm continuously working on myself, praising the areas in which I'm moving forward and observing the areas in which I am lacking or I could do better. And how might I do that? And I tie that into asking my own inner Christ awareness, the I am presence, the Creator, God, about what can I do better in this situation. And I think when we get into that mindset and having a conversation with God about these situations and our thoughts and our feelings and our reactions, but as we ask for the cultivation of more higher thoughts, then we're on the right terrain. We're on the right path. And the difficulty is not that we think. The difficulty is that most of us experience thoughts as facts. A thought comes into the mind. She must be upset with me, or he must be mad at me. And immediately the body reacts. Anxiety rises, angst, defensiveness starts. A second thought follows. What did I do wrong? And that's a common thought that many women have. What did I do wrong? Because they have a sensitive nature. Not to say men don't do it as well, but I found frequently women are asking that question, what did I do wrong? But it's more from a standpoint of personal pain than from a standpoint of trying to observe and be aware, could there be something I could do a little bit different moving forward? So after we have this thought of what did I do wrong, then another thought comes up. Maybe she has always felt this way. Maybe he has always thought this way. Another comes up. People always pull away eventually. And in a matter of moments, the original event is gone, and the person is now living inside a chain of reaction of interpretation. The mind can do something similar around work. It may say, I should have spoken up in that meeting. And then it goes to, I never say the right thing. And then other people are more confident than I am. This is all going on in one's mind here. And then maybe I am not really as capable as people think. But the person now feels shame, hesitation, a sense of self-doubt, as though something objective had been proven. And in personal identity, thoughts can become even more damaging because they often masquerade as self-knowledge. For example, I'm too sensitive. I always overreact. I can't change. This is just how I am. It's too late for me. These types of statements often sound stable and mature because they are familiar to the person who's thinking these types of thoughts. But familiarity is not the same thing as truth. Some of the most limiting ideas people carry are simply well-rehearsed distortions. And we call that, in the world of psychology, cognitive distortions that we can have that are hard to spot when they're happening because they're so internal and they come up so easily that we think they're real, but they may be fake. They're not true. The human mind is capable of brilliance, reflection, creativity, memory, and problem solving. But left unobserved, it is also capable of exaggeration, projection, catastrophizing, comparison, self-attack, and endless repetition. Not every thought deserves trust. It doesn't. Not every thought deserves trust. Not every thought deserves your emotional loyalty, because some of these thoughts drain us. Not every thought deserves to become a story in our mind. That is why the first movement towards freedom is not controlling every thought. It is noticing them, seeing the themes, seeing, that's interesting. It comes up with this particular type of person or this particular situation or circumstance that you find yourself in, or at work, or in your personal relationships. What are the thoughts that keep on coming up? You will not know them if you don't observe them. Let me bring this into everyday life through one of our reoccurring characters, Rebecca. Rebecca is in midlife. She is thoughtful, caring, responsible, and the kind of woman people often lean on because she values relationships deeply, but she also has an old sensitivity around disappointing others. She does not always talk about it, which many of us don't talk about these old things underneath the surface that are operating because we're unaware of them. But underneath her calm exterior, there is often a quiet fear of being misunderstood or rejected. One afternoon, Rebecca had lunch with a close friend, and the conversation is mostly pleasant. But near the end, her friend says, "You've been hard to reach lately." The comment is not loud. It is not hostile. It may not even be critical. But Rebecca feels something in herself tighten. And on the drive home, the thought stream begins. Was that a criticism? She sounded hurt. Maybe she thinks I've changed. Maybe I haven't been a good friend. Maybe I've become selfish. What if people are noticing I've pulled back? Then another layer starts. I've been overwhelmed. Why can't people understand that? I do so much for everyone. Maybe no one really sees me. Now the emotional energy has shifted from guilt to hurt, then from hurt to resentment. And by evening, Rebecca is no longer responding to one comment. She's responding to an entire inner narrative. Now, what is important here is not whether her friend truly had some disappointment. She may have. The important point is that Rebecca's distress has been amplified by what her own mind added to the moment. The mind took a simple sentence and filled it in with assumptions, emotional history, personal meaning, and fear. And later that night, after feeling unsettled for hours, Rebecca sits quietly and asks herself a question. What have I been telling myself since lunch? That question changes everything. And when we start to observe our thoughts and how they're spiraling out of control, that is the question we can ask ourselves. What have I been telling myself since lunch, dinner, interaction with a person, or whatever it may be? She begins writing down the thoughts. She thinks, I'm neglecting her. I'm failing as a friend. People always expect more than I can give. I'm tired of feeling pulled on. No one understands how much pressure I'm under. These are the things she's writing about. Now, Rebecca can finally see the machinery of the moment. The event was small. The thought chain was large. Her reactions did not come only from the comment. They came from the mind interpreting the comment through old emotional themes: pressure, guilt, invisibility, over-responsibility, and fear of relational loss. These are things that have filtered into that one comment that her friend made. And that awareness is powerful because now she has a choice. She can still decide whether she wants to reach out to her friend. She can still reflect on whether she has been less available. But instead of reacting from the emotional storm, she can respond from awareness. This is how growth begins. Not by pretending the mind is wrong about everything, not by denying feelings, but by distinguishing between what happened and what the mind made it mean, how it interpreted it. And this is what we have to do because we can live in this world of illusion and delusions of ourselves. One reason thought awareness matters so much is that thoughts are not neutral. They carry tone, energy, direction, consequences. Some thoughts constrict you. Some thoughts enlarge you. Some thoughts cloud the heart. Some thoughts clear it. Some thoughts pull you downward into reactivity. And some thoughts help you step back into steadiness. And what the soul is needing is for us to step back and move into steadiness. And that's where the observing process becomes a letting, say, what's going on here? Why do I keep on having all these thoughts? Why is this coming up so much in me? Because there may be a point of pain or discomfort that you have to be willing to look at and be able to say, oh, I can correct that by the Christ within me, by my soul awareness, by my spiritual path. We can work on these things. And it becomes a hopeful movement for it, not a helpless sense of self. And therefore we move back into comparison, or we move back into being critical of ourselves. No, that is an act of direction of one walking a spiritual path. This is why many of the great teachers, spiritual teachings, emphasize the importance of watchfulness, not paranoia, not obsession, watchfulness, inner attentiveness, the capacity to observe what is moving through consciousness, what is moving through your consciousness before it hardens into speech, action, or identity. There is also a deeper reason for this. The soul grows by learning how to align with truth. One of the most deceptive appearances in human life is the unexamined thought. Just because a thought is loud does not mean it is wise. Just because it is repetitive does not mean it is accurate. Just because it feels urgent does not mean it deserves action. I often say to clients and friends, a bird may land on your head, but it doesn't have to build a nest. Shake it off. Let it fly off. Many people suffer not only because of life, but because of the constant commentary they add to life. They relive conversations that are over. They rehearse fears that have not happened. They reinforce identities shaped by earlier pain. They speak inwardly to themselves in ways they would never permit from anyone else. And then they wonder why peace feels distant. It is difficult to have inner peace while living in a constant mental hostility. It's as if you're in a battlefield. We don't think of our mind as a battlefield of who's right and who's wrong and the opposing forces fighting against each other. We don't think about that, but in small ways and in large ways, we can have a little battle going on inside ourselves. And it is difficult to feel close to your deeper spiritual nature while you're fused with fear-driven thought patterns. We say we want inner peace, but we don't look at our thoughts and see if they're helping us or hindering us. And so it is difficult to experience clarity while the mind is projecting, reacting nonstop. And yet, the hopeful part is this. The moment you begin to notice your thoughts, you are no longer completely inside them. Awareness creates a little space, and that space may be small at first, but it is sacred, and it is the beginning of freedom. Let's move into our work lives. We spend so much time at work. But do you notice your thoughts and how they affect not only your relationships and self-worth, but also performance, leadership, visibility, and contribution? Michael is competent, intelligent, respectful in his field. He works hard. He often has strong ideas, yet in meetings, he tends to hold back. We see this common theme coming up. We have to be aware of the fact that what are we telling ourselves that is creating this holding back? And he tells himself he is just being thoughtful. But if he is honest, there is more going on. He often leaves meetings feeling frustrated that he did not say what he wanted to say. And one day after a strategic planning session, Michael notices that a colleague voiced a suggestion very similar to the one he had been considering. And the idea was well received. Michael feels a sharp drop inside, like a sinking of your stomach type of sharp drop. First, he's disappointed. Then he's irritated. Then he moves into self-criticism. And on the way back to his office, he catches the thought, see, you did it again. Normally, he would sink into that familiar frustration, and it would go on and on and on. And that frustration would lead to him being very critical. But this time, he decides to watch more carefully. What exactly happened internally in that meeting? He puts a watchful eye on what happened to me in that meeting. And he reconstructs it. Someone raised a problem. Michael had a solution. He started to speak, then stopped. Why? A thought had flashed through his mind. Maybe it's not developed enough yet. Then another. And if I say it poorly, it will sound weak. Then another thought. Someone else probably has a better version. And then another. Wait until you're more certain. By the time he had waited for certainty, the moment was gone. Now here is the important point. Michael had not consciously chosen silence. He had yielded to a rapid sequence of unobserved thoughts. That is how much power the unnoticed inner dialogue can have. It can shape an entire professional pattern without ever being named. And as he continued in his reflections about this, Michael begins to see that this is not only about one meeting. It is a long-standing thought pattern, thought habit. He has been treating hesitation as wisdom, when in many cases, it is fear dressed as professionalism. He has been telling himself he wants to be careful. And when sometimes he is simply protecting himself from discomfort. This is a profound point that needs to be heard. It happens with Michaels of the world and Julies of the world, many of the people of the world. Many people cannot change their outer behavior until they notice the inner script driving it. And Michael does not need to become loud or aggressive or performative. He doesn't need to turn into someone else, but he does need to notice the thoughts that keep interrupting his contribution before it reaches the room. Over the next several weeks, he begins practicing one simple intervention, which I invite you to think about this, if it applies what happens in your world. Whenever he feels himself pulling back, he silently asks, "What thought just told me not to speak?" That question slows the process. It brings the inner script into view. He starts to realize that the mind often confuses safety with silence. And once he sees that, he can choose differently. And little by little, his professional presence changes. And guess what? By Michael taking the time to reflect on his thoughts and how he processes information, over time, Michael's contributions become more visible because he transformed into someone loud or aggressive, but because he learned to notice the thought stream that kept him silent. He discovered that sometimes what feels like wisdom is simply fear appearing as a professional mask. He started to discern between what is the thing that's holding him back. It's usually fear or of people not accepting what's going to be said, or it's fear because they don't like to look incompetent. And what have we explored today? We've explored that most of us don't just have thoughts. We're being run by them. We've seen how Rebecca's simple lunch comment spiraled into an entire emotional narrative, and how Michael's professional hesitation has shaped not by lack of ideas, but by unexamined inner dialogue, unexamined thought processes. The spiritual principle here continues to be very helpful, that we need to be aware of, because God is always giving us an opportunity to discern, to grow, to enhance, to understand, and to be able to look at the higher aspects when we're walking that spiritual path. The soul grows by learning to align with truth rather than appearances, rather than being performative, rather than wanting to look good, which is part of that performativeness, but it's also part of wanting to show that you have presence. And what the soul is being aware of is one of the most deceptive appearances in human life is the unexamined thought. And our soul wants us to examine our thoughts. When you begin noticing your thoughts, you are no longer completely inside them. That's one of the other key points. Because we live so much in our head, so much in our thoughts, we believe That's our reality. And I need to emphasize now, that is not the case. Awareness creates space, sacred space. And that is the beginning of freedom, liberty. That is the beginning of knowing you truly have choices of how you want your thoughts to go. So in our next episode, we'll take this foundation deeper. We'll explore how thought awareness shows up in relationships, identity, midlife transitions. We'll look at practical questions you can ask yourself to disrupt, to interrupt is the better word, the limiting patterns, the limiting thoughts, the cognitive distortions. And we will discover how mastering the mind becomes a gateway to hearing your soul and the Christ within you. Until then, pay attention to the quiet voice inside, not to the fear itself, but to becoming more conscious about what it's saying to you and what you want to do as your next choice in order to shift the thought to be more intentional in your behavior. Something to think about. Bye for now.
Thank you for joining me for this episode on Mastering Life's Adventures, being your best self through soul evolution. If you have enjoyed what you've heard today, I would be delighted if you would share this episode with others, leave a thumbs up, and subscribe to my Mastering Life's Adventures podcast. Look forward to your joining the next episode. Please leave any comments or suggestions you might have below. Bye for now.